cultura constrói as memórias que preservamos e os futuros que idealizamos. Cultura transcende barreiras, conecta corações, transforma realidades. Acreditar na energia que vem da cultura é acreditar que as histórias transformam os palcos, os ritmos e os cantos desse país. São nessas histórias que encontramos a alma e a diversidade de um povo. Celebramos essa diversidade, celebramos cada cor, cada voz, cada sorriso e cada emoção. A cultura é reflexo dos nossos sonhos. Investimos nesses sonhos há mais de 60 anos, porque acreditamos que a energia que vem da gente é a energia que impulsiona vidas. Shell, energia que vem da cultura. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Um poder criativo que nasce dos palcos, orquestras, das artes, das ruas e dos museus. Na valorização das diversas identidades brasileiras e na preservação de memórias. Onde toca um instrumento, um futuro desperta. Nas trocas de saberes, sonhos e oportunidades se concretizam. Dos projetos que todo mundo conhece, aos que todo mundo precisa conhecer, é valorizando a cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Dizer que o Brasil é gigante não é nenhum exagero, mas um país desse tamanho não se move sozinho. Ele conta com mais de 200 milhões de gigantes, como eu e você. Gigantes que saem cedo de casa todos os dias, com força, dedicação, coragem, pelos trilhos, estradas ou aeroportos. Gigantes que não diminuem diante dos desafios, não têm medo de distâncias, nem do longo caminho até os sonhos acontecer. Por isso, só uma gigante, uma CCR, poderia estar ao lado dos brasileiros no desafio de mover de país. A CCR, 25 anos, mover o Brasil para gigantes.
Olá, pessoal. Boa noite.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's beautiful to see this place so full of you. We're already at 9 o'clock and the house is full to think about literature and outskirts. This is wonderful. So before our panel, I'm going to remind you of a few things. If you should need translation, we have the phone and the device for you to listen to the panel in Portuguese. Presented by CCR Institute, the first international panel of FLUB 2024 brings its own reason of existence. Poet and historian Beatriz Nascimento, who is an Atlantic woman. The panel CCR Atlantic Women is made of women that possess the Atlantic in their own identity. And it's an identity that crosses the ocean between Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. And it's present in the history of these authors, journalists, and intellectuals from the most consistent schools of modern contemporary thoughts, fundamental to the decolonization of the world. So let's start the CCR panel at Transatlantic Women with our dear Audrey Bouvard. Bless her. Let's please give her some standing ovation. I was looking for her in red, and she has already changed the clothes. She's divine now, so be welcome. Following Alden, Josefina Braco. Josephine, please. And closing this group, Fuarish. Please. Well, guys, mediation will be done by him, the co-creator of Flip, my dear friend Julio Ludemir. Please.
Que o fone.
Julio, it's an enormous responsibility. It's so extraordinary to be here. And first thing, thank you all. I think we should give some clarifications, and I'm gonna tell a short story first. We have done a macumba to protect and bring peace and a series of things. And Mr. Zay arrived to me and said, it's gonna be a success, but we're gonna have a lot of problems in the opening, in the beginning of the event. And I had all sorts of problems today. The first one, Yoruke, would be one of the participants of the panel, had some problems with her flight. She had to delay it, and she's trying to come. And followed by that, I think we had some problems with Annie Alice Franco's husband, and she couldn't come. And followed by that, Mami Fatou, that should be here with me in my place, being the mediator, she had a problem with her son, and she had to go back to New York. And that I am the only one here. I'm not a black woman. But it would be very hard for any other person to moderate this. I followed the not only the concept, but I also followed all the efforts to have all these three extraordinary women here. Josephine Apricor, she is a researcher on Afro and femininity gender issues in Germany. We have Audrey Beauvoir, who is a great journalist, vice mayor of Paris, and responsible for changing food habits in France. She is secretary of nutrition in Paris. And we have Fuarish, who is a great journalist, a great writer, and documentarist. I think you're from Norway, right? But she lives in London. So she has several books published. And you will see first place, we have to absolutely thank, because we had so many challenges throughout the way, and it was part of this talk to each of them and convince them to be here with us in this panel. And this is a great challenge. She came for other, situations, and they are having to adapt to being here right now. And I think we should start this panel with Josephine Apricor. I think that's what we arranged, because eventually she might need to identify herself with as a black woman. Still, even if she's within this context of great migrations, the context of a great circulation of African descendant populations that arrived to Berlin, where she lives, where she grew up, and where she built her career. And we have our first book published here in Brazil called Love and Gap. would you be this transatlantic woman, or wouldn't you be, or would you be not this transatlantic woman?
Me tonight. I know we kind of are trying to wing it. And to me, it's kind of unexpected because I was not supposed to be looking as good as I am looking tonight and also try to be clever. So thank you and bear with us. No, I don't identify as a woman. I identify as non-binary, and I think a big part of that is due to my experience as a Black person from Germany. And I think it's important to understand the German context, which is very different from the Brazilian context. In Germany, there are only roughly 1% of Black people, so this is a very different situation. Germany is a majority white country. I think that's important to understand as well. So I have never really fit into the category of women in Germany specifically, because the idea of what is a woman is very much tied to whiteness. And to me, it's very interesting to be sitting here today because I was actually, I brought a book of Oyeronke Oyewumi, who would actually be sitting here, and I actually quote her in my book that has just been published in Brazil as well. And I think it very much ties to what she is saying, that the invention of what a woman is also a white invention. There's also another scholar that I really like to quote on this. Her name is Kayla Schuller, and she talks about how the idea of race has also been tied to the idea of gender. So the idea of how white people are the only race who have a distinct gender, which is male and female. And a huge part of racism has also been the idea of Blackness, but also indigenous people not being able to produce clear two genders. So I think as a Black person in Germany, as a neurodiverse Black person also, a very tall Black person as well, I have never in any way, shape, or form fit into the category of what woman is. So, and I do know also in Germany that I am not the only person who feels that way. But I think it also kind of gives me freedom because I feel like my identity does not have to fit into a box. And that is really helpful to me to kind of always reflect, where am I, who am I, and also with regards to the context.
I still gonna ask you a second question. And now I'm gonna question from your talking about your mother, you know. All my relationships with women, I've always seen that link, that connection between daughter and mother. You were a daughter of a white woman. And normally we learn to love, our absolute love, coming from this relationship between mother and daughter, which is unbreakable. So where does this racial issue is place in this relationship? You, a Black woman, facing all these, struggle within this racist Berlin, and being a daughter of a white woman.
So I was just starting to write an essay, which is exactly on this topic, being a Black child of a white woman. And I do have quite a few friends that have very dire stories to tell about this. They feel like they have parents who are not interested in their experience, who even kind of try to gaslight or manipulate them to perceive their experience as what it isn't really. And I wanted to call my essay, I Am One of the Lucky Ones. And I say that because my mom has always done her work on this. And I think that's very important. And I do know that that is not something that all parents, white parents particularly, of children of color and Black children do. So there's one book which I hope will be translated into Portuguese as well, which in English is called Showing Their Colors. And it's one of the first books by Black German women that talks about the experience of being Black and German. And I think what is important to understand about Blackness in Germany, but also with regards to activism, is that it's always been a feminist movement. It's also always been a queer feminist movement. That is, I think, also in a way very particular for Germany as well. And that book came out in the year that I was born, in 1986. And just before I was born, and my mom is sitting there somewhere, she's kind of looking down. But just before I was born, she actually bought that book and she read it because she understood, even though I wasn't born yet, that my experience will be vastly different from her experience. And I think that has been really important for me. And I think another aspect that kind of shows that is that I could always talk to her when I experienced racism. Sometimes she would even say, "Oh, wow, that was racist." And I was like, was it? So I think I am one of the lucky ones. I had a parent who actually did the work that I think is very much necessary also for the relationship between me and her. That doesn't mean that we don't fight. We do, obviously, but not about racism.
Fu, gonna go to you now. A little bit thinking about what Josephine has just said, and your father, he faced a set of other racisms, but as a Jewish man, and your mother comes from Ghana, like her father. So, how did you live this, transatlantic flow within your own personal story? Muito obrigada, obrigada por ter-me aqui. É um privilégio falar com você. A minha experiência foi um pouco diferente. E eu estava pensando em como você descreveu. Eu acho que o fato de ter uma mãe negra foi uma parte formativa da minha infância, porque, como uma menina, eu acho que é muito comum que você quer ser como sua mãe. E quanto o trabalho minha mãe fez, e quando foi consciente, se você não conseguir equipar a sua criança, assim, você tem que trabalhar para isso. E como uma mulher negra do Ghana, ela me deu um sentido de que de conectude com a negritude. Isso me fez
adequate in many ways, that I wasn't black enough, that I wasn't African enough, because I think, like many little girls, I wanted to be like her. And that was especially confusing growing up in a society that had the opposite mindset. So while I regarded black womanhood as kind of the pinnacle of what I wanted to grow up to be, I was growing up in a world that told me that blackness was undesirable. All the influences around me, in my school, in the media, in the narrative about history that gets told in Britain, suggested that blackness was a bad thing and that actually progress was to assimilate into whiteness. And I really credit that dissonance with my work, because from a very young age I could see that there was some untruth in the message I was receiving. I knew deeply that I connected with my Ghanaian heritage. And, Ghana is actually a matrilineal society. It's one of, the Akan, the ethnic group I come from in Ghana, is one of very few societies in the world where you inherit through your mother. So I grew up not only with a Ghanaian mother, but with a world where women were my inheritance. And that was very much culturally dominated by these strong women. So I could see the disconnect between what I was experiencing and the message society was giving me. And, in Britain, like many European countries, not only is that not acknowledged, but it's difficult to even speak about. The people around me would say, "Don't worry, I don't see race." And they would say, "We don't even see you as black." That was supposed to be a compliment. And I knew I didn't want that compliment because I loved my blackness. So that set me on a journey of finding out, where are the people around me getting this idea that blackness is undesirable? Where does it come from? Why can't we speak about it? And that's why I published my first book, Brit-ish, which was exploring the dishonesty underneath the identity of Britishness. To answer your question about being a transatlantic woman, I think for me, that constant pull towards Ghana Ghana was the only place I felt I could make sense of my identity and where these ideas had come from. And I felt I couldn't piece the puzzle together until I understood more about the country of my heritage. I think for many of us who are Black growing up in the diaspora, Africa exists more as an idea than a place. You know, it's a place we project a lot of our fantasies about the past before it was disrupted by colonialism and slavery, a kind of pristine land of ancestral tradition that we want to get back to. And, you know, there's truth in that. I think so much of the wealth of our heritage has been destroyed and disrupted, and there's so much we can recover. But it's also important to go to African countries and see them, not see yourself or not see what you want to see, but to see them. And so that was a really important journey for me. I started when I was a teenager, going to Ghana for the first time. And since then, I've lived in Ghana. I work across West Africa. And I have stopped thinking of it as a gap in my identity that I need to fill, and thinking about it more as a purpose, that I can live my life asking what I can contribute to restoring the wrongs that have been done and actually building a different future for all of us as people of African heritage. And obviously understanding that the two are connected. You can't create a better future if you don't understand the wrongs that have been done in the past. And unfortunately, I think many of us are still having to fight for those wrongs to be acknowledged, for that story to be understood. And sometimes people criticize that, saying that, you know, we're looking back. The point of looking back is to see. You can't fix something until you see it. Blindness, saying you don't see something or we've moved on, is not a strategy for healing it. And if you want to create something better, you have to understand where we've come from and what happened, because the ideas that created colonialism and slavery never ended. There was no clean break in history where we just moved away from those ideas. They exist. The structures that were invented during that era remain. They're the reason why I self-identify as a Black woman. And we have so much work to do to understand that. And that work is power.
So I had the opportunity to live in London, and the presence of the Black person there in London, I lived in Brixton, and they were all from Jamaica and etc. I'm trying to reflect upon an idea of Taisalaisen, which has a Ghanaian origin, when she brings to the debate an expression, Afropolitism. If there is the idea of a Black person as always needing help, needing support, needing some argument in the field of inclusion, and she comes with this idea of Afropolitanism in the sense of talking about a cosmopolitanism existing in the great cities in Europe of the Black people. That wouldn't be anymore in the field of the naive idea of how cosmopolistic was your experience in London, leaving all those differences and diversities, all the paths that got to London.
Class society, and people are divided by class. It overlays with race. I think that the pattern of immigration to the UK was very different for people of African heritage compared to people of Caribbean heritage. And while we all have common origins, the patterns of colonialism and enslavement have created different histories for us. And when I was growing up, that was very real. So when I was growing up in London in the 80s and the 90s, it was very embarrassing to be African. I'm just going to say that. Nobody wanted to admit to being African. Everybody wanted to be Jamaican. Jamaica was reggae and dancehall and jungle, drum and bass. All of the slang we used to speak in London was very Jamaican oriented. Many of our African parents and grandparents who were coming to the UK came as students, or they came as professionals doing degrees. So there was a class difference in the migration experience. One of the most positive things that's happened in my lifetime is that Blackness has become a cohesive identity. So many people can name a Black British musician, artist, filmmaker. And, you know, it's interesting to hear what you said about this idea of Black people as victims who need help, because in Britain, Black people are literally the community keeping Britain going. Britain has been through all of these crises. The only consistent engine in our culture has been Black people. All of the culture we've created, we've exported, the language we've invented, the fashion that we've pioneered. A lot of what actually people are proud of in general in Britain comes from Black British people. And, you know, I think that that's not to be dismissive of the challenges that we face. A lot of my work is still identifying and naming the psychosis of racism in Britain. It's very profound. But I think, you know, we don't need to theorize about Afropolitanism because we've been creating it. And we're creating it everywhere that we exist. I guess for me, the focus now is on unity because it's very frustrating for me. I spend a lot of time in America. I live in LA half the year. And African Americans don't have a sense of being part of the same colonial story that Black people in Brazil have come out of, that Black people in Britain have come through. You know, European countries followed the same patterns everywhere they colonized. And America was a British colony before it was an independent country. It was Britain who exported race to America. Britain invented racism in America. But Americans see themselves as different. They see themselves as different to other Caribbean people. They see themselves as having a unique experience of enslavement. I really believe that we can acknowledge the uniqueness of all our cultural and historical experiences while also understanding the ways in which we are united, and that unity is such a crucial force. You know, I often look back to, we've been talking about Aimé Césaire, the Pan-Africanists, Kwame Nkrumah, George Padmore, so many incredible intellectuals from South America, from the Caribbean, from Africa, who 2 generations before I was born were creating a whole intellectual framework that acknowledged Black people cannot progress anywhere until we all understand the importance of our unity. And that unity also rests in the African continent, that until Africa is thriving, Black people can't thrive anywhere. These things are all connected. Sometimes I feel like we've gone backwards, you know, that my generation had to learn that as if we hadn't known it existed. I often find myself speaking about these things to audiences that don't know that work existed. And, you know, it's really important that we engage with the work of previous generations. Otherwise, each generation feels like they have to start from scratch. We have people who lived before who created a legacy for us to build on. And a huge part of that legacy for me is unity. That's one of the reasons I'm so happy to be here, because I see you all here hungry for this conversation. And, you know, these conversations are happening in every single country where there are Black people. It's just a question of how we can really harness the energy of those conversations and turn it into a movement that actually moves us forward.
Audrey Pulvar.
Audrey, you are French, or are you from Martinica? And why would you be French? And why would you be from Martinica?
Uma mesa ronda internacional. Vou falar francês.
I don't speak Portuguese. I'm going to be in French. Eu posso também.
Earphones. And about the earphones, I want to say that those earphones are not fit for my hair, my black hair. Okay. Okay, they are not fit for my black hair.
Désolé, madame.
Okay,
Pardon
and it's not the first time I tell that to the organization of Loop. This is not fit for our black hair, and it is not fit for some autochtone.
Je pense que tu peux parler en français. Nós temos
Não é adequado também para outros tipos de cabeça. Because, for example, last year at Floop, and all of them were having some decoration in their hair, and they were having these problems. So I'm from Martinica, or am I French? Well, yes, it's better to speak in French. Okay, for the translation is better. I work with Patrick Chamazot, who is a great poet from Martinica that was here at Floop. And I could say, as he does, I am a Creole from Caribbean, from America. I was born in Martinica, on the other side of the Atlantic. Regarding comparing to Ghana, comparing to Europe, and also regarding of course, the slavery movement and navigation. So together with the Caribbean population, it reminds me of the Brazilian population and all the components. You have black, we have white, we have the same history of slavery, colonialism, very similar cultures, very similar music. So I think that Brazil has learned a music from our culture in Martinica that here is called forró, which comes from a word in English, for all, which is a bow for all. So we have all music in common, we have histories in common, we have people in common. And obviously, I was born in Martinica, I'm from there, but I have a French passport, I have French nationality, because Martinica, it still belongs to France. So we are not a colony, but we are a kind of a department, French department. And I not only have two cultures, I don't have only the French culture and the culture for Martinica. I also have a Creole culture from Caribbean that results from all the stories of colonization, genocide, slavery, that were written in the past. I cannot say that my ancestors are all from Caribbean, but in Martinica, where I was born, Martinica was a country inhabited by autochthon people that were exterminated, and it was necessary to replace this population by the slaves that came from different countries from Africa. So we have our origin in many countries that mixed with the white colonialists, but we also had Dutch, Spanish, and in the majority of the islands in Caribbean, the autochthon populations were exterminated and replaced by populations formed by white colonizers and enslaved populations from Africa. So I have an African culture, I have a culture from Martinica, but I also have multiple Creole culture that comes from all these influences and the proximity in terms of geography from the United States, Central America, and South America. And I'm French, also European. So that's why I define myself as a Caribbean Creole from America. I write in French, I dream in French, I think in French, and also in Creole. And sometimes I dream in Creole, but it's rare. I have a Creole culture. And I think that I'm all of this at the same time. I'm French. And regarding my parents, I was thinking the parents that they said Josephine's father was from Ghana and also the mother from Ghana. And I'm thinking about having a father white or a mother white, but in my case, both parents are black. But I'm not a mixed. I'm a black woman, but I'm not sufficiently black for some. Because my father is black, but in the United States, they would say that he has a light skin, but he is black. But in my father's ancestors, probably they had a white, let's say a white patron that raped my grandmother or my great-grandmother. I don't know. But many times I made this reflection. Of course, it's not very agreeable to think that people is saying, no, you're not black. And people say, no, but you're not white. So I always answer that I know I am a black woman. And when I go looking for a place to live, or when I go looking for a job, or when I want to evolve and cross the glass roof, I know and I perceive that I am a black woman. And regarding the other blacks also that are darker than me. So you are a highly visible body in Paris. You are a person that is famous. People recognize you on the streets in Paris. You are the person that should be interviewing Mame Fatou, the person that is coming after you. You are a reference for a whole generation of black French women. I had the opportunity to see you being greeted on the streets, stopped and greeted on the streets, and people telling you how much you were important for them to keep this identity of a black person, a black individual. There was a black person in the French television. So you're a great reference also for the others. But what was your great reference? At that moment in which you enter this French society, you were practically an exception. So what was your stimulus? What was your reference to let you dare, and I think this verb is adequate here, when you dared to be the great novelty of the French television? How did you deal with it? And how much this also put you in the field of racism? So in Martinica, black, I was from a black family. I knew I was a black person. I didn't expect to find out that I was a black person. So, of course, this wasn't a problem there. And I grew up in Martinique. I left Martinique when I had 14 years old to finish my studies in Paris. And I really never made me this question to be the first black woman that is presenting a great TV news that had a great audience, because before this issue was being confronted, I was still 11 years old, and I decided to be a journalist. I was still in Martinique. And this decision I made when I saw a woman, not a black woman, a white woman that was presenting the news, TV news at the time. It was still very rare. That had the aspect of a person that knew about the topic. And before here, Benedita was talking about Beatriz Nascimento, saying that she was impressed by Beatriz Nascimento because she knew what she was talking about. And I had this impression of this woman, the only woman that had this kind of audience. So I was 11 years old. I looked at her and I said, I want to be like this woman, because I knew that many women are not like that. I want to be like this woman in a position of authority, of credibility, and also of knowing about these important topics. So I knew I wanted to be a journalist. So I finished my studies in France, and then I went back to work in Martinique, and then I came back to Paris. I went back to Paris when I was 30 years old in 2002. And it was at this moment when I was 30 years old, and I had already worked as a journalist during 15 years, that arriving in Paris, I was confronted with this issue. Oh, a black woman that is going to present the TV news in a great channel with a great audience. But I never saw someone saying, I'm a black woman. I always said to myself, I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist. I know I'm a black woman, but I'm a journalist that is trying to find a job as a journalist. And my ambition is to become a good journalist. So that with this criteria that I was moving forward, and people would say, oh, but look at this. We are looking for black women to know, but I don't want to be chosen because I'm black. I want to be chosen because I'm a good or a bad journalist, and so I'm not chosen. So when people started to think about this, that this dimension of the first black woman, but I didn't care about this because I don't, but of course I knew that it was very important also to have this symbol. But as all black women present here, I had to do it in a better, double and triple to have and to build my career as a journalist. Many people think that I have a wonderful career, but they don't see everything that I didn't reach. Not only because we had this glassy roof, but I didn't have just a glass roof. I had a cemented roof over my head. And it got to a moment in things were very difficult. It was a beautiful career, but it could be even better if there wasn't racism.
Afua, you were also a very public person in London, a known face in London. You are a reference to, possibly a reference to other women, black women inside the United Kingdom. And I had the opportunity to see a very particular moment of London after George Floyd's murder. And that resulted in an explosion of interest in the black issue, leading to Bernardine Evaristo, who will be here in 2 days with us. And Reto, I can never say her name. Both became #1 as bestsellers of the most sold books in London. And something changed in that time. So what changed? We are talking about a generation that becomes more mature, you know, with all this story, as you mentioned before. But at that specific moment, these two books that were the first time of of fiction, and another writer of fiction and nonfiction arrived to the list of the top 10, the top 3, the first places of bestsellers. So do you understand what happened that led to this? More than this, that this thing would be consolidated.
It very well. So Bernardine Evaristo, who's going to be here, won the Booker Prize in 2019, and I was one of the judges on the Booker Prize. And it was actually quite well publicized that I had to fight for her book to win the Booker Prize. And so I can tell you personally what happened. What's been happening in Britain is that there was this idea of diversity where you include one black person in every space. And that's been happening for a long time. It made white people in Britain feel very good about themselves. They could tick the box. What's never talked about is the subtle system underneath, which was the message to that one black person in the room was, you should be grateful to be in the room. Now that you're in the room, you must assimilate into the pre-existing culture in the room. You must not draw attention to your difference. You must absolutely not celebrate or be proud of your blackness. That you are here on condition of good behavior. Be a good immigrant. Be a good black person who does not rock the boat. And I'm not making this up. There is a literal system of penalties and rewards in Britain that rewards black people for coming into the room and not changing anything. For example, in Britain, the king recognizes good work by giving you an honor. It's called an Order of the British Empire. It's celebrating the empire. And it's saying to a black person, if you do well, we will reward you on the condition that you're willing to celebrate the empire. Now, if you're a black person from Africa or the Caribbean, it's asking you to trample on the graves of your ancestors by disrespecting their legacy and pretending that the empire was a benevolent force. And the reason that exists is to send a message that you are allowed to be successful on the condition that you perform this set of values. So what's changed is that now when black people are getting into the space, we're using our platform to bring in more black people. We're using our platform to be unapologetic, to be vocal. And so when I was on the Booker Prize, there were 5 judges. I was the only black judge. There was the assumption that I would behave exactly like all the other judges, that I wouldn't have a different perspective, that I wouldn't have a different lived experience, that I wouldn't have values that other people didn't see. And they were happy for me to be in the room until I started to behave differently from the white people in the room, to have a different mindset, to have a different way of seeing the world. And, you know, I use that as a metaphor because I think that's the change. And I think it's important to speak about it because, you know, with my work, many black people come up to me and they say, I agree with everything you say. I'm just too scared to say it in my workplace, in my family, in my world. I'm worried if I tell the truth, I'll lose my job. If I criticize how racist Britain is, my neighbors won't speak to me. My children will be ostracized at school. So this is the continuing double life that we live, that now on top of not seeing race, there's this celebration of diversity. People want black people to be there. They just don't want us to be who we actually are. And I'm very clear that if you want me, what you get is my actual real self, my way of seeing things, my knowledge of the history that my own ancestors lived through. And I think 2020, you know, a lot of people really wanted to believe that racism was in the past, that everything is getting better. There's been a black president in the White House. There is a black person in every corporate room, and we've moved on. And I think that's why many people who hadn't really been paying attention were really shocked. With George Floyd's murder, you could divide the world in 2 halves, those who were shocked and those who already know every day how violent the world is to black bodies. And those people weren't shocked because we already know and feel that injustice, and that's our work. So, you know, I welcome when people wake up and are more conscious. And, you know, with everything that happened in the US election, it's been a hard time for people who care about justice and truth. But I also think there are many people who have not been awake, who have not been paying attention. And the only silver lining I can find is that this wakes us up to see how much work there is to do. There is no room for complacency. And that's something that we can work with.
Josephine, I'm gonna try to ask you a question. I don't know if I should, you know, I'm not sure if here, if you are amongst the three of you, if you are the person who should answer, but just gonna try to, you know, start this conversation through you. We just had a great experience in terms of Black narrative of the world, in particular a narrative of a Black woman that organized utopias in the world. This was Kamala Harris. And at a certain point, I had the sensation that we would be here at this moment celebrating her victory. But we are here not to feel, you know, sad and not give up, surrendering to the victory of misogyny, racism, anti-diversity. That happened now, this November. So I would ask you, how did you organize your utopia? How did you know, get enthusiastic of the fact that we could have had a woman that came from another place, a transatlantic woman in a certain sense, governing the biggest economy of the world? And I would ask you to, how are you trying to avoid being desperate, you know, by facing the answer that the United States gave during this election by electing someone else?
So I come from a country that has a copyright on fascism, I would say. And I think in a way, I don't know how to say this in a way that people understand right away, but I think I'm not necessarily sad that she didn't win. And when I say that, it is because I don't necessarily believe that we're at this moment where people are actually, you know, about to open the door to utopia. Because I think, Afua, you said something about we have to see the past. And I think we also have to see and acknowledge the present. And I think that is something that is just not happening. So in Germany, we're very much in a very similar situation. There are a few parties that are right-wing, and the next election was supposed to be at the end of next year. It looks like it might even be at the beginning of next year, because our parliament has just dissolved. And that is also due to all of the populist forces that we have in this very moment. And I think, to me, those moments can also be a force of change, because I think sometimes it's necessary for people to actually understand, take a break, look around them, and see where we are at. And in Germany, I can say, and I think that might be true for the US as well, is Germany is a country that is very deeply rooted not only in colonialism, but also in anti-Semitism. And I think we need to take a break to actually acknowledge that this is not in the past, that this is not something that has been very long ago, but that this is who we are to our core, even now. So for me personally, organizing utopia is not necessarily a thing where, you know, I need this one person that will take us all there, but I think it's more of like all of us organizing, finding ways to organize, to take care of each other, to do that, and to be able to not only give care to someone, but also to be able to say, yes, I need support. That community also means not only giving, but also learning to receive, because in a capitalist society, we think receiving is wrong. So for me personally, I don't necessarily think that we need this one person in the biggest economy, but I think we need all of us to be able to think about the ways in which we can actually take care and create community in our everyday lives. So I don't necessarily feel saddened. I did in the first moments, I do have to admit that, but I don't necessarily feel saddened, but I think, you know, it's what it's always been. It's time to move. It's time to get creative. It's time to stay creative. It's time to take care of one another and to actually be curious to understand what it means to take care and to receive care. So for me, this is where I'm kind of going to.
Eu não sei como é que tá o...
I don't know how we are about in terms of time. Now, if we have time or not, I need you to tell me. So I'm going to open for questions. Do you have questions? Thank you. All right. All right. Should I stay down, sit down? All right. So for Josephine, I was thinking about this perspective, you know, the panel is women, transatlantic, but you identify yourself as non-binary, and calling attention to this. I also identify like this. And I'd like to hear from you, how can you build references, you know, about breaking these gender barriers, not only from the perspective of being opposed to the existing model. So how do we seek how do we look for positive references? So as a Black person, I always dealt with opposition, and that's how I built my identity. If I'm not accepted here for what I am, then I am different from you. So how do we try to seek for other references that are more connected to the sense of, you know, connection to the earth, to the environment, and not only to physical things such as wearing pants and lipstick?
First of all, thank you so much for your question. I totally understand what you're saying. I just had two things that came to my mind. One of them being, I used to give guided tours on German colonialism because there is a huge so-called African quarter, which is actually a colonial quarter. And I used to do that with a very good friend of mine, and she started giving tours on colonialism and women with regards to colonialism. And at some point, we both studied African studies. She said, well, I kind of start feeling strange when I talk about women all the time when I refer to African women, because the idea of so using the same word woman for white women and Black women, when I'm trying to also explain that there were Black women warriors, where the idea of whiteness, specifically in Germany, was always tied to being demure, to being in the back, to being quiet, and so on and so forth. We kind of talked about that. So I think even this, like referring to ideas of society that have not always been shaped by womanhood, but one of the people who should actually be sitting here is actually talking about, in her book, about Yoruba culture and how society is works around age. And I think that could be a reference. And then I was also thinking about a friend of mine who was talking to me just a few days ago, and they were saying, well, you know, I had such a hard time kind of identifying as non-binary, and then this person invited me to a radio show, and it was a kind of feminist round table, and they were saying, and you didn't defend yourself. You didn't someone misgendered you, but you didn't defend yourself. And then I realized, this is something for me. This is not something that I have to defend. I know who I am. Other people who will meet me on the street might not necessarily know, and they might not even have heard of the idea that there might be more than two genders. And I think this is, to me at least, this is something that is really important, is when we think about the world and when we think about oppression, very often we do that from a perspective of, we look at someone and we can identify them. When really, I think, and that's one of the aspects with regards to gender, I think is really interesting, is we might not. So what does that mean? And what does that mean for my self-identification? For me personally, it means this is who I am, and I know who I am. This person right there might not know, and this person also might not know, because we've never met. But this is something for me. So I think for me, it also means I don't have to defend myself. I know who I am, and that's fine.
A pergunta para as três, né?
Question for all the three of you. How do you see literature, the written literature for us Black women? It's something so painful when we write. We talk about our lives, our experience, our body. So how do you see this writing that is transatlantic? It surpasses the barriers when it's Black, when it's trans, when it's non-binary, it crosses borders. What's the importance of this writing to the Black community? For instance, my daughter. How do you see the importance of this writing for the future generations? Hello, good evening.
Thank you so much for that question. And I'm so happy your daughter's here. I can see her looking mortified that you're referring to her. My latest book I wrote is called Decolonizing My Body. And I specifically wrote it for my daughter because it's the book that I wish my mother had read. And that book is really acknowledging that we come from millennia of tradition as Black women where there were rites of passage that initiated us into the different stages of life, that there were values that regarded us as becoming more beautiful, powerful, and useful to our communities with age. And now we live in societies that have inherited this very Eurocentric cult of youth that have destroyed or deliberately erased ancient knowledge systems that actually, as we go into climate crisis and growing inequality, the whole world needs these knowledge systems more than ever. And I'm not trying to go back to the past. I'm recognizing, though, that in the past there were many ideas and forms of understanding that we need, and that I needed them as a girl, and that now I was in a position where I also wouldn't be equipped to raise my own daughter with them, because my mother didn't raise me, my grandmother didn't raise her. You can see the intergenerational damage. And I think this is the thing about writing by Black women, that we have been guarding this knowledge. So many women in different languages and different places have been using the written words to preserve it. I feel really ambivalent about books and the literary world. I read a lot of Wanyugi Othiongo, who talks about asks, can you really decolonize in the colonizer's language. You know, for me, the tragedy is I don't speak my mother's language. I only have European languages. And even in using them, I acknowledge that the way it shaped my mental process is biased towards Eurocentric thinking. So I can't change the languages that I speak, but I can acknowledge that even in the way I think, the European values have infiltrated my consciousness. The written word is a very Eurocentric value system. It's erased oral knowledge and inherited oral histories that so many indigenous cultures used. And I do my work in the written word, in the English language, because it's the tools that I have to try and guard that knowledge and pass it on. But I also acknowledge that it's problematic, it's flawed, it's infiltrated, I guess, by colonial ideas. But for me, honesty is the best starting place, just seeing and acknowledging and being honest about where we are and trying to build from there. And I think for all of us, you know, I wrote Decolonizing My Body. I'm not lecturing other women about what a decolonized body looks like for them. I'm just being honest about my journey, examining myself. And it came out of acknowledging that I do so much work critiquing colonial systems in the world. But when it came to my own body, my relationship with my femininity, with my sexuality, with my fertility, with my aging, I was infected with all these really toxic colonial ideas that I hadn't unpicked. So I saw the gap between what I did in the world and how I thought about myself, and I decided to try and close it. And that's something that all of us can do. And we are so helped by all of the Black women before us who have also done that work, who have left a legacy. And also in oral histories, you know, to do that, to write that book, I had to go and interview my 95-year-old grandmother. I see my grandmother all the time. It was only when I went with an agenda to ask her these specific questions that she told me things that I had never heard her say before. So even right in front of me was this bastion of ancestral knowledge that I'd never properly connected with. And sometimes you have to be really intentional to start healing those wounds. Thank you for the question.
Alors, je pense que
it is very important that women, Black women, and also men, but that Black women write, because this is a tool and a free, something that we can use freely. A Black woman, and I'm gonna go back to these, I'm gonna quote Janira Ribeiro, a Black woman is free to say, to create, to write whatever she wants, the way she wants. And thus I think that we should not think that we are closed in this injunction of writing about the Black causes and issues, but
Doesn't matter if it was about that we are writing. We are always developing a perspective of a Black woman. So this Blackness is going to grab you anyway. It's there, it's present. And I also think there is a book that I read, that I discovered a while ago, some years ago. I discovered this Afro-American author who was not well known in France, and that wrote few books in the United States, but they are few books, but they are very powerful. So powerful. William Melvin Cayley. And the first romance, his first novel that I read, and that really, it ended up in my hands because I didn't even know who he was. I just grabbed the book and I read this book that tells a story of a white couple from the 60s. So there are some interactions with some Black people, but the topic is the couple. And there was something strange in the way he wrote. I couldn't understand. And I said, so strange. It's written as if it were Richard Rousseau or Jonathan Franz, but there is something different. So I understood afterwards when the book started to talk about the confrontation with the black people and understanding that the author was black, I realized what was really making me feel strange is the story of a white couple told by an Afro-American, a black man. So when I started by writing a novel 20 years ago, and I also interviewed artists and writers, and I used to say, how can I contribute? What am I going to write about? Since we have James Baldwin, Morrison, they have already written, Richard White, so many people have already written, talking about the best ones. Why am I going to write? Because at the end, I'm not going to have anything to add, or I'm going to write something that doesn't have anything to do with these topics. So at the time, a writer told me, well, you can write whatever you want about whatever you want. So I started writing this romance, this novel. And this novel is hyper black. A novel about a black woman that talks about many generations, and it's a novel that couldn't be written by a white woman or man. So I write using the language of the colonizer, but it's a Creole French. And it's a Creole French that is not, it's not of a patois, it's a language, but it's also a way that I have, a tool to use and to appropriate this language that was imposed to us, creating words, ideas, new ideas, Creole ideas. And sometimes people tell me, oh, why didn't you put, for example, a lexicon, right? So that we can understand. And I said, no, because when you get into the rhythm of the book, it's not a problem not to understand one word here or there, because there's not only one Creole, there are many Creole languages. For example, there are more than 100 Creole languages in the world. In the Caribbean, you have a Guadalupe, Haiti Creole, that is different from Santa Lucia's Creole. So we can understand each other when we speak in Creole, but it's very different one from the other. So the musicality, the Caribbean aspect of the text is very present in the novel. And I wrote in French, yes, and I enjoy the French language. I enjoy its complexity, and okay, this use a plural, here use a singular, right, and the past tense, and how it confronts. It's a kind of a chemistry. But I write as a Creole Caribbean woman. And the novel that I wrote was a Caribbean novel. And all the ones that I wrote afterwards, the same, a black woman, right? And when I write poetry, I haven't published yet. I don't think it's very good, but it's a Caribbean poetry also.
We're in Brazil, so I had to think about Conceição Evaristo and Escrevivência, and how writing and living are so much connected also. And I think, to me personally, I think that is such an important practice of kind of connecting the everyday experience and then trying to find words to transport them so someone else can connect to them. And I think for me, and I think that is also relevant with regards to the German context, is that I always think about who will read my books. And I do write about racism, and the obvious choice is most of the time thinking about white people who should learn something about racism. But whenever I write, whatever I write, I always have Black people in mind. And I think that is something that is very important. So, for example, the book that was just published here in Brazil that I wrote about love and how oppression comes up in loving relationships as well. I think the part that was most important for me to write was the part about how we feel oppression in the body. And I wanted to make sure that someone who reads it, who experiences anti-Blackness as I do, can feel held by the words that I share. And I think that could be a part of it, making sure that we connect writing and living, and also thinking about the people who we love when we do that and who we want to write for. So I write for Black people, I write for my younger self, I write for my child, who also, by the way, starts expecting that I write, whatever I write for her or about her. I write for my younger sister, I write for people who experience anti-Blackness but who don't have the words yet. So I think it's the practice for me personally of writing and living and writing and living.
Ok. Olá, boa noite. A minha pergunta.
Good evening. My question is for everyone, but I'm going to direct to Afua. It was possible to listen to you, and the experience of racism has affected many aspects of your life, family, body, and all these subjective matters. I'd like to put a question. I think it's a little bit complicated, but I'd like to know how you, Afua, has put this process of constructing an identity beyond racism, trying to find possible roads for finding a Black identity, and not acknowledging the history and the importance of this process of looking behind it and learning with the legacy, but at the same time, it doesn't go around this experience of the violence of racism. Is it possible, first of all? And being possible, which ways can we consider?
I love that question. Thank you. I always say in Britain, and I think many places, there are kind of two ways you connect with your Blackness as a minority. The first is through the negativity of racism, but the second is through the joy of Blackness. And one of the problems with being a minority is that you begin to connect your identity with the violence of racism. The way you learn about your existence as an otherness comes from the white gaze. And there's a danger that then you start to define yourself from that gaze. And one of the things I find myself saying more and more with age is, if we had a blank slate, what would we create? How would we define our identities? How would we self-identify? How would we envisage our place in the world if we were starting from scratch? I guarantee nobody in this room would design what we currently have. If we were starting, if we could create anything, no one would create this. What we have is based on psychosis, violence, and exploitation. We would never invent it. So I guess for me, my challenge, I had to fight so hard for the people around me to acknowledge that violence and that history. But I think in a way, my newest book, Decolonizing My Body, is me saying, I fought, I won in terms of my own peace, and now I'm going to start creating. I'm going to start using my imagination. I'm going to start reclaiming what I choose as my inheritance. And just the intention of that was so powerful for me and marked a real turning point in my own journey. And I think that for me is why I'm so interested in the knowledge systems that were passed down ancestrally, in the culture and the creativity and the invention that our ancestors have been making for millennia. And I think there is a way as well that when you look at indigenous cultures everywhere, it's so remarkable how much they have in common, how much continuity there is. I got my hand tattooed, and this is a tattoo based on my Akan culture from Ghana. It's a pattern that represents storytelling in my culture. I had to go back to the 1700s because my particular family were converted to Christianity in around 1750, so they started to abandon their traditional practices. And when I started researching tattoos, I discovered that every single indigenous culture I could find in the Arctic, in the Amazon, in Europe, in the Alps, in the Middle East, in Asia, across Africa, they all had similar patterns of marking and adorning their bodies as a way of acknowledging their role in the community, their service to their people, and their identity, whether that's as a warrior or a storyteller or a mother or a healer. And, you know, for me, this was a symbolic statement of my intention to be very specific and powerful about what I choose as my identity. And, you know, I think it's important to have the conversation about race and heritage and identity, and I do that, but it's also not a question of the content of your DNA. You know, race is a fiction. It's nonsense. It doesn't exist in science. We talk about it because it was socially constructed, and that's real. But it's not a question of how much blackness you have, to Audrey's point, or exactly what genes you inherited. For me, it's a question of who are your people? Who are your people? What is your mission? What is your purpose? Who do you serve with your life? That's something everyone gets to choose. And when you think through the lens of community and purpose, then you also have power and agency over the identity you create. It's about what you will do and what you stand for. And I think that is such a powerful thing. And we also come from lineages of people who helpfully modeled what it means to have community and to stand for something. And so that is what I am channeling going forward. Thank you so much for asking that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Boa noite.
Rapidement sur la
So the issue of racism, because all the issues are important. I think that it's not possible to do it as it doesn't exist. I'm 53 years old, and all the time I was confronted by racism, including when I was a black child living in Martinique. And if it wasn't regarding my family or myself, it was the other people around us. And today in France, I live in Paris for more than 20 years. And I'm well known, I'm respected. I work with the mayor in Paris, and they call me, they talk to me, and anyways, I'm confronted by racism, even if we had all these codes of the society completed in my action. So I said, what is happening to me? What is happening to the migrant woman that doesn't speak French, that doesn't know the uses and customs, that finds herself in a very complicated situation, all the blacks, non-whites in France. So racism, yes, exists. It was a system implemented centuries ago, and we cannot pretend that it doesn't exist or that we weren't a victim of it. But we can be victims and survivors. And what I always say when they make me a question, especially youngsters, when they say, we are still here, they would like us to disappear, all right? That I should be delegated to inferior workers. But we are here, we are in a great number, and we are still here and growing. So regarding the future, regarding Kamala Harris, I was very sad that she wasn't elected. But I think it's never too early, but I understand your perspective. But I'd like to say that we have to count on the Black women. We can always count on them. I have nothing against men, Black men. You can come together with us. But I'm really forced to agree that some Black men, youngster or not, voted for Trump. Or not for Trump, but voted against a Black woman as a president of the United States. So I think that we always can count on the Black women because the Black women are a model of resilience, of resistance, of progress and advance. And while we have Black women in power, the extreme right and the patriarchal system will have some worries ahead.
We have three other activities now, and if we go on with this conversation, I'm gonna have to sacrifice Elia de Tamarca's show. I would stay here for more 5 hours, but we have the schedule to go on. And we've been here since 1 p.m. I've been given the sign to, finish and have the show started. I just want to thank you. I don't want to be the person to say we have to stop, but if we don't stop, I'm going to have problems, And so would it be a problem if we finish now so that we can have the show? Otherwise, we don't have the show and we don't have the Roda de Samba. I'd like to thank you all once again.
Quando era pequenina, foi levada